What if I told you that McLaren is not just playing for an improvement in Miami, but for the entire course of its season? Because while many believe that this is just another update, Oscar Piastri has sent a message that completely changes the perspective. The team knows that it is far away, it knows that it cannot win at this moment. But it also believes that what is coming can bring them suddenly closer to the real fight. The big question is, are we facing the beginning of McLaren's comeback or facing its last desperate attempt to not fall behind permanently? Stay until the end, because what's behind these improvements is not what it seems. The start of the 2026 season has left a completely unexpected feeling within McLaren, because what seemed like the natural continuation of a dominance built with precision for years has transformed into a much more uncomfortable reality, where the team no longer sets the pace but tries to follow it, and that changes absolutely the entire internal focus, pressure and narrative that surrounds both the car and its drivers, especially when you come from being champion and suddenly find yourself in a position where you are no longer the reference but the pursuer. This context is essential to understand why Oscar Piastri's message is not simply another statement, but a direct X-ray of the moment the team is going through, because from the first races it was clear that McLaren is not in the fight for victory, that the car does not have the necessary pace to compete against Mercedes and Ferrari, and that there is a real gap that cannot be hidden with optimistic speeches, which completely breaks with the dominant image that they had previously built and forces them to rethink all the expectations they had for this season. The most shocking thing is that this situation does not come from nowhere, because in modern Formula One it is not enough to have a good technical base, but you need to constantly evolve. And although McLaren had proven to be one of the most aggressive teams in development, as it already did with key improvements in decisive moments in the past, it now faces a scenario where its rivals have taken a faster and more forceful step, leaving them in a kind of no man's land, where they are not easily caught up from behind, but neither can they fight face to face with the leaders. And it is here where the figure of Piastri becomes even more relevant, because far from falling into the typical discourse of blind trust, he has opted for a much more strategic position, recognizing the problems but at the same time pointing out the potential of the car, which reveals that within the team there is a very clear duality. On the one hand, the evidence that they are not at the necessary level, and on the other, the conviction that they have the tools to reverse that situation if they manage to correctly execute their development, something that in Formula One can make the difference between staying stagnant or stage an unexpected comeback. However, what really changes the course of this story is the moment in which Miami appears on the horizon, because it is not just another race on the calendar, but rather the point chosen by McLaren to introduce a package of improvements that has been worked on for weeks, taking advantage of an unusual break that has allowed them to analyze, correct and evolve the car in more depth than normal. And that makes this Grand Prix a kind of definitive exam where all the team's internal work will be put to the test. Piastri lets it be seen very clearly when he talks about this pause as an opportunity, because in his words there is something more than simple optimism, there is a real expectation of change, as if he knew that the car we will see in Miami will not be the same as the one we have seen in the first races, and that is what raises the narrative tension of this moment, because it is not just about improving a few tenths, but about checking if McLaren still has the ability to reinvent itself and become competitive again against the best. But at the same time, there is a feeling of uncertainty that cannot be ignored, because in Formula One not all improvements work as expected, and many teams have opted for evolutions that in theory were supposed to change everything and that in practice have not had the desired impact, which means that McLaren is in an extremely delicate point where the margin for error is minimal, and where the result of this evolutionary package can define not only its immediate performance but the rest of its season. The real core of this whole scenario is not only in the improvements as a concept, but in what they represent internally for McLaren, because when a former champion team is forced to rely on a major update to compete again, that means that there are structural problems in the performance that could not be corrected with simple adjustments, and that is where Piastri's message takes on a much deeper dimension, since he is not talking about a small step forward, but about a possible complete change of direction in the behavior of the car. During these weeks of break, the team has had something that in Formula One is almost a luxury: real time to understand the car, analyze data without the immediate pressure of a race weekend, and work on solutions that are not temporary patches. And this is key, because one of the biggest problems when you are behind is that you cannot stop and think, you simply react. But in this case, McLaren has been able to break that cycle and focus on finding deeper answers to its limitations. This is where the real tension of the event begins to build, because the improvements that will come to Miami are not a typical incremental evolution, but everything points to a much more ambitious package, one that seeks to unlock the potential that both Piastri and the team insist exists within the car, but that so far they have not managed to exploit. And this connects directly with the idea that the problem is not only pure speed, but how the car delivers that performance in different conditions, something that can make enormous differences on the track. Piastri's own speech suggests that the team has identified very specific areas where they are losing performance compared to their rivals, especially in key moments of the lap or in situations where Mercedes and Ferrari seem to have a clear advantage. And that is what makes this update so decisive, because it is not about improving in general, but about directly attacking the weak points that have prevented them from fighting for victories since the beginning of the year. But there is something even more important that hides behind all this, and it is the internal pressure that a bet of this caliber generates, because when a team concentrates so many expectations on an update, the risk also increases proportionally, since if the result is not what you expected, you not only lose time in development, but you can also compromise the rest of your season, being trapped in a technical direction that does not take you to where you need to be, and that in such a competitive grid can be devastating. And it is here where Piastri's message once again takes center stage, because his optimism is neither overflowing nor naive. It is measured, almost calculated, as if he perfectly understood that this is a turning point where everything can change, but also where everything can become even more complicated, and that duality is what defines this moment for McLaren. A constant mix between the hope of becoming competitive again and the real risk of being permanently left behind if the improvements do not meet expectations. As Miami approaches, the narrative intensifies because it is no longer just about what the team believes it has achieved in the factory, but about how that work will translate on the track, where real conditions, direct comparison with rivals and execution during the weekend will be what dictate the true impact of these improvements. And it is precisely at that point where the destiny of a season is often defined, in that moment where theory faces reality and where there is no room for interpretation. The climax of this entire story inevitably comes in Miami, because that is where everything that McLaren has worked on in silence stops being theory and becomes reality, and it is precisely at that moment where Piastri's message takes on its final meaning, since everything that he has hinted at for weeks is put to the test in a single weekend, with no room to hide weaknesses or justify results. Because in Formula One the stopwatch does not understand promises, only pure performance. This is where it is really defined whether we are facing the beginning of a comeback or facing the confirmation of a deeper problem. Because if the improvements work as the team hopes, McLaren will not only close the gap with Mercedes and Ferrari, but could completely change the dynamics of the championship, repositioning itself as a real contender and reactivating a fight that seemed to have cooled down since the start of the season, something that would fit perfectly with its recent history of evolving the car at key moments and radically transforming its performance. But if the result does not live up to expectations, then the scenario changes completely, because it would no longer be a simple lack of punctual performance, but rather a clear sign that the technical path chosen is not the correct one, and that would force the team to rethink its development in the middle of the season, losing valuable time against rivals that are not only already faster, but also continue to evolve, further widening the gap and leaving McLaren in a position that is increasingly difficult to reverse. And in the midst of all this, the figure of Piastri is once again key, because his message has not been that of someone who promises immediate victories, but that of a driver who perfectly understands what is at stake, who knows that the car has potential but who is also aware that this potential must be realized now, at this exact point in the season, because later it could be too late. And that is the real tension that surrounds Miami, not only what they can win but everything they could lose if things do not go as they wish. They wait. In the end, this Grand Prix becomes much more than a race. It becomes a dividing line within McLaren's season, a moment that can redefine its competitive identity, its position on the grid and its ability to fight for greater goals. And that is what makes Piastri's message so powerful, because it is not simply optimism, it is an implicit warning that this is the moment where everything can change. Because in Formula One there are moments that mark seasons, and Miami has all the signs of being one of them. McLaren's situation before the Miami GP is not simply a complicated phase within the season, it is a decisive moment that puts much more than a few points in the championship at stake. Because everything we have seen so far, from the irregular performance of the car to Piastri's statements, leads us to the same conclusion. The team has reached a limit where it is no longer enough to resist, now it needs to react. Piastri's message, far from being another optimistic phrase within the paddock, ends up becoming the common thread of this entire story, because it perfectly summarizes the reality of McLaren. They know that they are far away, they know that they cannot yet fight for victories, but they also know that they have a unique opportunity with these improvements, an opportunity that not only depends on the potential of the car, but on the team's ability to execute everything perfectly at the exact moment. Miami therefore stops being just another race on the calendar and becomes the point where the truth is revealed, where it is confirmed whether all that internal work, that time gained during the break and that measured confidence that Piastri transmits have a real foundation, or if, on the contrary, McLaren will continue trapped in that no man's land that has defined its start to the season, without being able to catch up with the leaders but without real pressure from behind. And that is where the true importance of this moment lies, because in Formula One, seasons are not always lost due to large visible errors. They often slip away at key points like this, where an update works, or not, where a team makes the leap, or remains stagnant, and McLaren is exactly at that crossroads. In the end, everything comes down to a single unknown that completely defines Piastri's message. Will Miami be the beginning of the comeback that returns McLaren to the fight for victory, or the point where it is confirmed that this season has no turning back? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.